I remember the first time I saw the cabin, how small it looked in the middle of all those tall pines. The roof sagged slightly, the wood dark and damp from years of rain and snow. The windows were smudged, barely reflecting the overcast sky. It was exactly what I needed. Quiet, isolated, a place to get away from the world. That was the whole point. I had spent too much time drowning in city noise, in the weight of too many people packed together. Out here, there was nothing but trees and sky and the sound of the wind scraping through the branches. The drive up had been rough. The dirt road twisted through the forest, deep potholes jarring my truck so hard I thought the suspension might give out. I hadn't seen another car for nearly an hour before I arrived, which made sense, considering how far out the cabin was. That was what I wanted. I kept telling myself that. The first day passed easily enough. I unpacked, stacking canned food and bottled water on the old wooden shelves. The power worked, but it flickered sometimes, and the water had a metallic taste. Still, I wasn't complaining. It was better than nothing. I spent the rest of the day cutting wood, stocking up a pile next to the cabin. By nightfall, I was sore, but I felt good, accomplished. I built a fire, cooked some food, and sat in the dim light, listening to the sounds of the woods. That night, I woke up to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a rhythmic creaking, like something swaying back and forth. It took me a few seconds to place the sound. The front porch. The old wooden boards groaned under weight, like someone shifting their stance. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, listening. Silence. Then, another creak. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could. My heart pounded in my chest, but I told myself it was probably nothing. An animal, maybe, a raccoon or a deer. But I still grabbed the old hunting knife I had left on the nightstand, just in case. The cabin had no curtains. I had been meaning to put something up, but I hadn't gotten around to it yet. As I moved toward the front door, I stayed low, keeping out of sight of the windows. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows along the walls. I reached the door and pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. I stayed there for a while, listening. Nothing, just the wind whispering through the trees. Finally, I stepped back. Probably just my imagination. I told myself that over and over. But even after I went back to bed, I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found footprints on the porch. Not animal tracks. Shoes. Boots, maybe. They led from the steps to the door, stopping right in front of it, then turning around and going back into the woods. I stood there, staring down at them, my breath curling in the cold morning air. Someone had been out here last night. Someone had walked right up to my door, stood there, and then left. The road leading to the cabin wasn't well traveled. I hadn't passed a single other car on the way in, and I had locked the gate at the start of the driveway. It was an old padlock, rusted but strong. No way someone just happened to wander in by accident. They had to have come here on purpose. I told myself it could be a hunter someone lost, but deep down I knew that didn't make sense. Why wouldn't they knock? Why wouldn't they call out for help? I spent the rest of the day on edge. I chopped more wood, checked the lock on the door 3 times, and kept looking toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But I never did. That night, I stayed up late, keeping the fire burning. I kept my knife close, listening for anything out of place. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard it again. A creak on the porch. I froze. My grip tightened on the knife. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. Someone was out there, standing right on the other side of the door. I moved as quietly as I could, crouching near the window. The fire was low, but it still cast enough light to see. I looked out, but all I could see was darkness. The porch light barely reached beyond the railing, and the woods beyond were pitch black. Then a shadow moved, a shape just at the edge of the light, a figure standing still just beyond the porch. My pulse slammed in my ears. I couldn't make out a face, but they were tall, just standing there, watching. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me crouched by the window, them standing in the dark. Then, After what felt like forever, they turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I needed to leave. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. Someone was out here, messing with me, watching me. I wasn't about to wait around and see what happened next. I packed fast, shoving clothes and supplies into my bag. I stepped outside and froze. More footprints, dozens of them, leading up to the porch, circling around the cabin. They had been all around me, moving in the night while I sat inside, unaware. I locked the door behind me and started toward my truck. The woods were silent, too silent. I had never noticed before how quiet it got in the mornings. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I got in the truck and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Panic rose in my throat. I popped the hood and got out. As soon as I looked inside, I knew. The engine had been messed with. Wires cut, something torn out. Deliberate. That was when I heard it. A sound from the trees. A soft rustling. Someone moving. I turned fast, scanning the woods, but I saw nothing. I wasn't waiting around. I grabbed my bag, my knife, and started walking. The road was miles long, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I walked fast, almost running. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see someone following. I never did, but I knew they were there. After what felt like hours, I reached the main road. It wasn't much, just a 2-lane highway cutting through the trees. I stood there, catching my breath, looking both ways. Then, in the distance, I saw a truck coming. I waved it down. The driver was an older guy, wearing a flannel and a baseball cap. He rolled down his window, looking me over. "You all right?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Truck broke down," I managed. "Need a ride?" He hesitated, then gestured to the passenger seat. I climbed in. As we pulled away, I looked back one last time. The woods were still, the road empty, but deep in the trees, just at the edge of the shadows, I swore I saw movement. Someone standing there, watching as I left. I never went back. I was never the kind of person to believe in fate or bad luck, but after what happened at that cabin, I don't know what else to call it. It started with a simple plan, just a quiet getaway. No work, no responsibilities, no distractions. I needed it. Life had been getting to me, grinding me down. My job was a mess. My apartment felt like a prison, and I just wanted to be somewhere still, somewhere away from people, noise, and expectations. I found the cabin online. It was cheap, isolated, and had everything I needed. The listing made it sound perfect. A peaceful retreat deep in the woods, with stunning lake views and miles of untouched wilderness. The pictures showed a rustic little place with a wraparound porch, a wood-burning stove, and a dock leading straight into a glassy lake. It seemed like paradise. The owner even mentioned that the nearest town was about 40 miles away, which was exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long, and the roads turned from paved to gravel to nothing but dirt. My GPS lost service an hour before I arrived, and by the time I saw the cabin, the sun was starting to dip below the trees. It looked just like the pictures, maybe even better. The lake stretched out in front of it, still and perfect, reflecting the thick tree line that surrounded it. No other cabins, no boats, no sounds besides the wind and the occasional call of a bird. It was exactly what I needed. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked under my feet. I found the key under a loose rock by the door, just like the owner had said in their last message before I lost service. The inside was simple, wood-paneled walls, a couch that looked older than me, a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with a shower. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a small radio sitting on the counter. The windows faced the lake, and I stood there for a while, just watching the water. That first night was peaceful. I made a simple dinner, drank a couple of beers, and sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. The stars were unreal out here, brighter than I had ever seen. When I finally went to bed, I felt lighter than I had in years. The next morning, I woke early, made coffee, and sat outside. The lake was so still that it almost looked frozen. I decided to explore a little, so I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine was strong. I walked for a while, just enjoying the quiet. It was only when I started to head back that I noticed something strange. There were footprints on the trail. Not mine. These were fresh, leading in the same direction I was walking. They weren't there when I left the cabin. I was sure of it. But now, there they were, deep impressions in the dirt, the kind made by heavy boots. I stopped and listened. Nothing. Just the wind in the trees. I told myself it was probably just a hiker, maybe a hunter. It wasn't my land, after all. But it still felt wrong. I walked back faster than before, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. By the time I reached the cabin, I felt a little stupid for being so paranoid. I made breakfast, read for a while, and eventually convinced myself I was overthinking things. But then, later that afternoon, I saw something else. I was on the porch watching the lake again, when I noticed movement near the tree line on the other side. A figure standing just between the trees, too far away to make out any details, but definitely a person. They weren't walking, weren't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. A chill ran through me. I tried to convince myself it was just another hiker, but why would they be standing there, watching? I raised my hand in a half wave, a silent acknowledgement, but they didn't respond. They didn't move at all. I went inside, locked the door, told myself I was being ridiculous. After all, they were across the lake. They couldn't get to me unless they had a boat, and I hadn't seen one anywhere. Still, I kept glancing out the window, expecting to see them again, but when I looked, they were gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound put me on edge. The wind against the cabin, the creak of the old wood, the occasional splash of something in the water. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked, there was nothing, just darkness and trees. The next morning, I decided I had had enough. Maybe I was overreacting, but something felt wrong, and I wasn't about to ignore it. I packed my things, loaded my car, and was about to get in when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, leading from the tree line to my porch. The same heavy boot prints I had seen on the trail. Someone had been here. I didn't hesitate. I got in my car, started the engine, and sped down that dirt road without looking back. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, until I was miles away from that place. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing, I wasn't alone at that cabin. And I don't think I was supposed to leave. I don't know why I agreed to this trip. Maybe I felt like I needed a break from the city, from the noise, from the way the walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, that I could handle being alone in the woods for a few days. Either way, I regretted it almost immediately. The drive up was long, the roads winding through thick forest, the trees leaning in so close they blocked out the sky. I lost cell service an hour before I even reached the cabin. That was expected, but it still left me feeling cut off. The cabin itself was old, sitting at the edge of a narrow dirt path that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was smaller than I thought it would be. Just one floor, a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with a fireplace that smelled like old ashes. I brought enough supplies to last me the week. Canned food, bottled water, a camping stove just in case the old gas range didn't work. I had a lantern, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a hunting knife that I didn't really know how to use but brought anyway. I wasn't trying to be stupid about this. I planned ahead. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. In the city, there's always noise, cars, sirens, people talking in the street. Here, there was nothing but the occasional creak of the trees shifting in the wind. I lay in bed, listening to the silence, feeling my heartbeat thump in my ears. Then, just as I started to doze off, I heard something outside, a branch breaking. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon digging through the brush. It was nothing. I rolled over, pulled the blanket tighter around me, and forced myself to sleep. The second day, I went out to explore a little. The woods were thick, the ground uneven, covered in layers of dead leaves and fallen branches. I followed a small stream for a while, hoping I'd find something interesting, a waterfall maybe, or a clearing with a nice view. Instead, I found footprints. They weren't mine. Too big, too deep, like whoever made them had been carrying something heavy. They led in a straight line through the trees, disappearing into the undergrowth. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, my skin crawling. It wasn't impossible that someone else had been through here recently. Hikers, hunters. But there was something about the way the prints looked that unsettled me. Like whoever made them wasn't just passing through. Like they had a purpose. I turned back. That night, I locked the cabin door. I checked it twice. Then I closed the curtains, even though I wasn't sure why. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Just because I found some footprints didn't mean anything was wrong. But that feeling wouldn't go away. That itch in the back of my skull telling me something was off. I woke up to the sound of breathing. Took me a second to realize it wasn't mine. It was deep, slow, coming from just outside the window. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. I wanted to sit up, to grab the knife I kept next to the bed. But I was afraid that if I moved, they'd know I was awake. I stayed like that for what felt like forever until the breathing stopped. Until the sun started to rise and the faint light of morning crept through the curtains. Only then did I force myself to move. I got up, heart hammering, and walked to the window. The ground outside was disturbed. The dirt was scuffed, as if someone had been standing there for a long time, watching. I told myself I was leaving, right then and there. I didn't care if it was just my imagination, if I was overreacting. I wasn't going to spend another night here. I packed my things in record time, stuffing everything into my bag without bothering to organize it. Then I grabbed my keys and stepped outside. My car was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty space where it had been. I knew I had parked it right there, directly in front of the cabin. I knew it, but now there was nothing but tire tracks leading back down the dirt path. My stomach dropped. My legs felt weak. Someone had been here. Someone had taken my car. I turned back toward the cabin, every nerve in my body screaming. The door was still open from when I'd rushed out, my bags still sitting on the porch. I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. I didn't know what to do. I had no phone, no way to call for help. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no idea if I could even find my way back without getting lost. My only option was to wait, to hope that maybe whoever took my car had just moved it down the road, that they'd come back. But they didn't. Night came and I was still alone. I locked myself inside the cabin, barricading the door with a chair. I kept the knife in my hand, my pulse thundering in my ears. Every sound made me flinch. Every creak of the old wood, every rustle of leaves outside. I didn't sleep. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. They stopped right outside the door. Then the doorknob turned. The chair held. The door didn't open, but they didn't leave. They just stood there, waiting. I don't know how long it lasted. Hours, maybe. The longest night of my life. When the sun finally rose, I inched toward the window, barely daring to peek outside. The porch was empty, but the footprints were still there, deep, sunken into the wood. Proof that I hadn't imagined it. I had to leave. I grabbed my supplies, my knife, anything I thought I could use, and I ran. I didn't care if I didn't know the way. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached, until the cabin was nothing but a distant nightmare. It took me hours to reach the main road. I must have looked like a lunatic, waving down the first car I saw, babbling about the cabin, about what had happened. The man who picked me up didn't believe me. He just nodded along, said he'd take me to the sheriff's station. When we got there, they asked me for details. I told them everything. They sent a deputy out to check the cabin. They found it exactly as I left it, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there but me. And my car? They found it in the town's parking lot, keys still in the ignition. I don't know who took it. I don't know who was out there in the woods watching me, breathing outside my window. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back. I never liked the idea of staying in a cabin, but I needed to get away. City life had worn me down. Too much noise, too many people, and not enough space to think. So when my friend Mark told me about his uncle's cabin deep in the woods, I figured it was exactly what I needed. A week alone, no distractions, just me and nature. Sounded perfect. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, winding through miles of thick forest. My cell service had died halfway there, leaving me completely cut off. When I finally arrived, the cabin was smaller than I imagined. A simple, one-room structure with a small porch and a chimney. It looked old, but sturdy. The only other building was a shed off to the side, its door slightly open. I unloaded my supplies, canned food, bottled water, my sleeping bag. There was no electricity, no running water. Just a wood-burning stove, an old cot, and a small table with a single chair. A lantern hung from a hook on the wall, and a stack of firewood sat by the stove. It was late afternoon when I decided to take a walk. The trees were thick, their trunks stretching high, their branches tangled together overhead. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I followed a narrow trail deeper into the woods, but after a while, I realized I wasn't sure which way I had come from. I turned back, trying to retrace my steps. It took me almost an hour to find my way back. By the time I saw the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees. That uneasy feeling started creeping in. Being alone in the woods sounded peaceful in theory, but in reality, it felt different. It felt like the trees were watching me, like the silence was pressing down on me. That night, I sat by the fire, eating a can of cold beans. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I tried to shake the feeling that something was off, but it stuck with me. I told myself I was just adjusting, that it would feel better in the morning. I barely slept. Every sound outside made me jolt awake. Branches cracking, leaves rustling. I told myself it was just the wind, just the forest settling. The next day, I decided to check out the shed. The door was still slightly open, creaking as I pushed it wider. Inside, there wasn't much. A rusted axe leaned against the wall, a pile of firewood stacked in the corner, a few tools old and worn, but something felt off. The dirt floor had been disturbed, like someone had been digging. My stomach turned as I stepped closer. The ground was uneven, loose in places. I left the shed, locking the door behind me. I told myself I was imagining things, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The third night was the worst. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. The wind had stopped. The woods were silent, too silent. Then I heard it, a slow, steady crunching sound. Footsteps, not an animal, something heavier. I held my breath, gripping my pocket knife. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving closer, then stopping right outside the door. I sat frozen, listening. Then nothing, just silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things. I didn't care if my week wasn't up. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my bag into the car, I glanced toward the shed. The door was open again, wide open. I knew I had locked it. I didn't check. I didn't want to know. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I never told Mark what happened. I never told anyone, but I know what I heard, and I know I wasn't alone out there. I don't know why I agreed to it in the first place. Maybe it was the idea of solitude, the need to get away from everything. Life had been a mess, and I figured spending a week in a remote cabin, away from people, away from stress, would help clear my mind. It was an old place I had found listed online, deep in the woods, far from any town. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin, simple but sturdy, sitting near a lake. It seemed perfect. The drive took me longer than expected. The last 20 miles were nothing but a dirt road, barely wide enough for my truck. Trees lined both sides, thick and endless. I didn't pass a single car. There were no signs, no houses, just trees. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures. Maybe even better. It had a small porch, a single window facing the front, and a door that looked like it had seen better days. Inside, it was simple. A kitchen area with a small stove and an old fridge. A living room with a couch and a wood-burning stove for heat. A bedroom with a single bed and a window that looked out into the trees. The bathroom was small, but it had running water. Everything smelled like wood and dust. I unpacked my bags, set up my things, and spent the rest of the evening walking around the area. The lake was calm, its surface like glass. The air smelled fresh, clean. The only sounds were the rustling trees and the occasional call of a bird. Felt peaceful. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the wind outside. It wasn't completely silent. Wood creaked as the cabin settled, and I could hear the occasional movement of animals outside. But it was natural. It was nothing to worry about. I told myself this over and over as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. A soft, shuffling noise. Faint, but distinct. It was coming from outside. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded deliberate, like footsteps, slow, careful. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a deer passing by, maybe a raccoon rummaging through the firewood pile. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. The noise stopped. The silence stretched on. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. The woods were full of sounds, and I wasn't used to them. I lay back down and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles. No clear footprints. I told myself I was being paranoid. The second night, I woke up again. The same sound. Slow, deliberate footsteps. This time, they were closer. I didn't move. I just listened. My heart pounded in my chest. Then silence. Long, heavy silence. I stayed awake for hours, listening. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. The third night was worse. The sound started earlier, just after midnight. It wasn't just footsteps this time. There was a soft scraping noise, like something being dragged across the wooden porch. Then the sound of something tapping, light, rhythmic. My stomach twisted. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then it stopped. Just like that. I waited. Nothing. I told myself not to look outside. Whatever it was, I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to know. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. The wooden chair I had left on the porch was moved. It had been dragged several feet from where it had been. But that wasn't the worst part. There were scratches on the wood. Long, deep gouges like something had been scraped against it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had done it. A bear, a mountain lion. But it didn't make sense. That night, I locked the doors. I closed the curtains. I sat awake with my flashlight in hand, listening. Around 2 a.m., the sounds came back. This time, they were different. A slow, deep breathing sound, right outside the bedroom window. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. Then the doorknob rattled. I grabbed the knife from my backpack, my heart slamming in my chest. The rattling stopped. The breathing stopped. Silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat awake until the sun rose. The moment daylight hit, I packed my things. I didn't care about my plan to stay a full week. I wasn't spending another night in that cabin. As I loaded my bags into the truck, I felt something, a presence. I turned slowly. The woods were empty. The trees stood still. But I knew I wasn't alone. I got in the truck, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never found out who or what had been outside my cabin those nights. But I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I just wanted to get away from everything. Either way, I ended up alone in that damn cabin. And I wish I never had. It was my uncle's place, deep in the woods, far from town. A hunting cabin, more of a shack, really. One room, a wood stove, a cot, and barely enough insulation to keep out the cold. He used to come up here every winter, always bragging about how peaceful it was, how much he loved the isolation. I never understood it. Being alone in the middle of nowhere never sounded peaceful to me. It sounded like a bad idea, but after everything that had happened in my life, I figured a weekend away wouldn't hurt. A break from people, from noise, from everything. The drive up was long. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my truck. Trees pressed in on both sides, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The sun was setting when I finally reached the cabin. It was exactly how I remembered, small, weathered, like it had been standing there for 100 years. The woods stretched endlessly behind it, dark and silent. I felt uneasy, but I pushed it down. It was just a weekend, couple of nights. Then I'd be back home. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. There was a stack of firewood in the corner, an old rifle mounted above the door, and a single lantern on the table. No electricity, no running water. Just me, the cabin, and the woods. I set my bag down and lit the lantern, the dim glow casting shadows along the walls. It was colder inside than I expected. I threw some logs into the stove, struck a match, and watched as the flames caught. The warmth spread slowly, but the feeling of unease didn't fade. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was in a strange place, alone. My mind was just playing tricks on me. But that night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made me sit up, heart pounding. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. The wind howled through the trees, and I swore I heard something moving around the cabin. Probably just animals. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. That's what I told myself. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw tracks in the dirt. Too big for an animal, too narrow to be from boots. I crouched down, touching the indentations. Fresh. Someone had been here, watching. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe just someone lost. I looked around, but the woods were empty, silent. I told myself it didn't matter. I was armed. I had the rifle. I'd be fine. But as the day passed, the feeling got worse. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. The trees seemed closer, the woods darker. I tried to distract myself, chopping firewood, making coffee on the old stove. But my mind wouldn't let it go. The tracks, the noises, the feeling in my gut that told me something was wrong. That night, I locked the door and kept the rifle close. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and then footsteps, slow, careful, moving around the cabin. My throat went dry. I held my breath, gripping the rifle so tight my knuckles turned white. I waited, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the door. Minutes, hours. I didn't move until the fire burned low, until the cold crept back in. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but I knew better. Someone had been out there. Someone had stood just feet away from me, listening, waiting. Morning came slow, dragging the night away with it. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, and checked the ground. More tracks, clearer this time. They circled the cabin, stopping at the door, then disappearing into the trees. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't just passing through. They had been watching me, testing me. I needed to leave. I packed my bag, grabbed the rifle, and locked the cabin behind me. The truck sat where I left it, covered in a thin layer of frost. I climbed in, turned the key. Nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. My breath came fast. I turned the key again, pumping the gas. Nothing. I popped the hood, stepped out, and lifted it. The battery cables were gone, cut clean. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone didn't want me leaving. I stood there, breath fogging in the cold air, trying to think. The nearest road was miles away. My phone had no signal. I had two choices: stay in the cabin and wait for help that might never come, or start walking. I chose to walk. The sun was already low. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. I grabbed my bag, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and started down the dirt road. Every step felt heavier. The silence pressed in. The trees felt closer. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. I walked for an hour before I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me, distant but steady. I didn't look back. I kept walking, faster now, my hands clenched around the rifle strap. The footsteps followed, gaining, closing the distance. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering. Then the crunch of leaves, closer now. Too close. I spun around, raising the rifle. Nothing. The road was empty. The woods, silent. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But I knew I wasn't. Someone was out there. Someone was following me. I turned back, started walking faster. The sky was darkening, the cold biting deeper. My legs ached, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I had to keep moving, had to get out. Then I saw it, a shape standing in the road ahead. Tall, still, waiting. My breath caught. My fingers tightened on the rifle. The figure didn't move, just stood there, blocking the road. I took a step back. The figure took a step forward. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking. "Stay back," I said, my voice hoarse. The figure didn't react, didn't speak, just stood there watching me. Then, slowly, it stepped off the road, disappearing into the trees. I didn't wait. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed. The road blurred beneath me, the trees a tunnel of black. Then headlights, a truck coming down the road. I stumbled into the middle of the road, waving my arms. The truck skidded to a stop. The driver, a man in his 60s, face lined with worry, threw the door open. "What the hell are you doing out here?" I gasped for breath, trying to speak. He helped me into the truck, turned the heat on, and started driving. I looked back once, just once, and in the fading light, standing at the edge of the trees, I saw the figure watching us go. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked my uncle about it. I didn't want to know, and I still don't. I don't remember exactly when the feeling started, but I know it was there long before I had the sense to acknowledge it. Something was wrong with that place. I should have left the moment I felt it, but I didn't. I stayed, and that was my mistake. The cabin was supposed to be a getaway, a retreat from the stress of work and the noise of the city. It belonged to a friend of a friend, someone I had never met, but they were kind enough to let me use it for the weekend. It was deep in the woods, far from anyone or anything, the kind of isolation I thought I needed. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, stretching the trees into long, thin shadows that seemed to claw at the road. It was a simple place, one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with a fireplace. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no distractions. Just me, a few books, and a weekend of silence. I unpacked my bag, set my phone on the counter, knowing it would be useless out here, and started a fire in the old stone fireplace. The air inside had been cold, stale, like it hadn't been lived in for years, though I knew that wasn't the case. That first night was quiet, too quiet. I thought I would enjoy the peace, but it was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I tried to sleep, but every sound, the wind through the trees, the creak of the cabin settling, felt amplified, like something was moving just beyond my sight. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. But that didn't explain the feeling in my gut, that deep, instinctual sense that something wasn't right. The next morning, I woke to find the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before bed. Absolutely sure. But it was standing slightly open, letting in the cold morning air. My first thought was that I had been careless, that maybe I had been too tired when I arrived and forgot to turn the lock. But as I stood there, Staring at the door, I felt it again. That gnawing unease, the quiet certainty that something was wrong. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling. I read, I walked through the woods, I even chopped some firewood just to keep myself busy. But every time I stopped, I felt it creeping back in, that overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I started noticing little things, subtle, almost insignificant, but enough to unsettle me. My bag had been moved slightly. The book I had left on the arm of the couch was now on the floor. The firewood I had stacked outside looked disturbed, like someone had sifted through it. Each time I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had moved the book without thinking. Maybe an animal had knocked over the wood. Maybe I was just being paranoid. That night, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone standing behind me. The shadows seemed deeper, the dark corners of the cabin more menacing. I forced myself to go to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay there in the silence, heart pounding, every nerve in my body on edge. Then I heard it, a soft sound, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, a shuffling noise just outside the cabin. Not an animal, something heavier, something deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. The sound moved around the cabin, slow, methodical. My mind raced. Was it a person? A bear? The footsteps stopped by the front door. Then, after a long pause, I heard the handle rattle. I froze. My body screamed at me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, every muscle locked in place. The handle rattled again, harder this time, like someone was testing it. I waited for the door to swing open, for the intruder to step inside. But it never happened. The rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the night. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there until the first light of dawn, my mind racing through every possible explanation. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They weren't mine. They were too large, too heavy. Someone had been out there. Someone had been watching me. I packed my things in record time. I didn't bother eating, didn't bother cleaning up. I just threw my bag into the car and got the hell out of there. I didn't look back. I told myself it was just some stranger passing through. Maybe a hunter, maybe a hiker who got lost. But deep down, I knew better. That feeling, that bone-deep dread hadn't been paranoia. It had been a warning, and I was just lucky enough to listen before it was too late. I still don't know what I was thinking when I agreed to stay at the cabin alone. It was my uncle's place, deep in the woods, far from any town, any road, any real civilization. It wasn't meant to be a getaway spot, not really. It was more of a hunting cabin, old, small, built from thick logs that had darkened over time. The kind of place that felt ancient, even though it had only been standing for a few decades. I had come out there for a simple reason. I needed time away from everything. Work, people, the noise of the city. My uncle had mentioned the cabin to me in passing, saying it was just sitting there, unused. If you ever need space, it's there, he had said. So I took him up on it. A week, maybe two. Just me, the quiet, and the woods. The first few days were fine. Peaceful, even. I woke up to the sound of birds instead of traffic. I spent my time hiking the trails around the cabin, chopping firewood, and cooking simple meals on the old stove. There was no electricity, no running water. Just a well outside, a wood-burning stove, and an old generator I didn't bother using. At night, I read by lantern light and listened to the wind move through the trees. Felt like exactly what I needed. But by the fourth night, things started to change. I started noticing little things that I had somehow missed before. Small, out-of-place details that didn't sit right. The first thing was the footprints. I had woken up early, just as the sun was starting to rise, and stepped outside to get some water from the well. The ground was soft from the rain the night before, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, clear as day, leading up to the cabin, and then nothing. They didn't lead away. They just stopped at the front door. My footprints from the day before were there too, but these were different, bigger, heavier. I stood there for a long time, staring down at them, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I had tracked them in myself, I thought. Maybe they were old and had just filled with rain. But that didn't sit right. Something about them felt fresh. I tried to shake it off. I had been alone out here for days. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. But then came the second thing. That night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a sound, not loud, but enough to snap me awake. It was coming from outside, a rustling, slow and deliberate, like something moving just beyond the tree line. I held my breath, listening. A few seconds passed, then nothing. Silence. I exhaled, telling myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, a raccoon. Nothing out of the ordinary. The next morning, I checked outside. The footprints were gone, wiped clean. The rain had stopped the day before, and the ground was still soft, so they should have still been there. But they weren't. It was like they had never been there at all. That day, I couldn't focus on anything. I tried to busy myself, chopping wood, cleaning up the cabin, anything to distract myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made my skin crawl. The wind against the cabin walls, the creak of the wooden beams settling. It all felt wrong. Then, on the sixth night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was close, just outside the cabin wall, slow and steady, deep. I lay frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. I just listened. The breathing didn't stop. It stayed there, just on the other side of the wall, long and rhythmic, like whoever or whatever it was just standing there, listening. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, the sound faded. Not quickly, not like something walking away, just slowly, like it was melting into the night. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. The next day, I decided I was leaving. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I packed my things, threw them into my truck, and got ready to go. But the truck wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. I tried again. Nothing. I checked the fuel. Plenty. The battery? Fine. Everything should have worked. But it didn't. I felt my stomach tighten. I was stuck. I told myself I'd try again later. Maybe it was just cold. Maybe the spark plugs needed a minute. I went back inside, trying to keep calm. I'd figure it out in the morning. That night, I barricaded the door. I pushed the old wooden table against it, along with the chairs, anything I could find. I don't know what I thought it would do. Maybe nothing. Maybe it just made me feel like I was doing something. I barely slept. At some point, in the middle of the night, I heard it again. The breathing. This time, it wasn't outside. It was inside. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. The breathing was slow, measured, close. I could hear the shift of weight on the wooden floor. Someone was standing in the cabin. I wanted to move, to grab the axe I had left beside the bed. But I couldn't. My body refused to listen. I just stayed there, paralyzed. The breathing moved, slow and steady, across the room, toward me. Then it stopped. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Minutes? Hours? Eventually, the first light of morning crept through the window, and just like that, the feeling was gone. I sat up, my whole body shaking, and looked around. The room was empty. The barricade was still in place. The door was locked, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That morning, I went back to my truck. I didn't even try the engine. Instead, I opened the hood. The wires were gone. Not chewed through, not frayed, gone. Like someone had reached in and ripped them out. I didn't think. I didn't stop. I just grabbed my bag, took my uncle's old rifle from the cabin wall, and started walking. I didn't know where I was going, only that I was leaving. I hiked for hours, deeper into the woods, following the old trails, until I finally reached the dirt road that led back to town. By the time I made it to the main road, the sun was starting to set. A truck passed by and I flagged it down. The driver, A middle-aged man in a flannel shirt looked me over, then nodded for me to get in. I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there, catching my breath. "You all right?" the man finally asked. I looked at him, then back at the road ahead. "No," I said. "I don't think I am. I never went back to the cabin. I never asked my uncle about it. Whatever was out there, whatever had been in there with me that night, I didn't want to know, and I never would. I should have never gone up there alone. Looking back, it was a mistake from the moment I put my key in the ignition. But I needed the break, or at least that's what I told myself. The city had worn me down, and the idea of spending a week in the mountains, disconnected from everything, seemed perfect. The cabin was deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. It was an old family place, something my uncle had built in the 70s and barely maintained. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, some propane lamps, and an outhouse a few yards away. Exactly what I wanted: isolation. The drive was uneventful, but as I got closer, the road turned rough. The last few miles were more like a trail than a road, barely wide enough for my truck. Overgrown branches scraped against the sides as I crawled up the mountain. There were no signs, no markers, just memory guiding me. By the time I arrived, the sun was already starting to set, and the air had that crisp, biting chill that reminded me how far I was from home. The cabin looked the same as it always had: weathered, dark, and slightly crooked. A single padlock on the door was all that kept it shut. I pulled the key from my pocket, twisted it open, and stepped inside. Dust floated in the air, catching the last bits of light through the window. The air was stale, a mix of old wood and mildew. I dropped my bag on the floor, stretched my arms, and took a deep breath. Silence. It was the first time in months that I wasn't surrounded by the hum of the city, by voices, by cars. Just the woods and me. It should have been peaceful. I spent the first hour unpacking, stacking wood near the stove, and checking for leaks. The roof was still solid. No signs of animals getting inside. Good. I made a quick meal from the supplies I brought, canned soup and crackers, then lit a lantern and sat by the small wooden table in the center of the room. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches. The sound was normal, but something about it made me uneasy. Maybe I was just adjusting to the quiet, my brain filling the emptiness with paranoia. Still, I locked the door before heading to bed. I woke up sometime in the night to a sound I couldn't immediately place. Not the wind, not an animal. It was a dull, rhythmic thumping. I lay still, holding my breath, trying to listen. The sound came again, from somewhere outside. Thump, thump, thump. I sat up, my heart pounding. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear rummaging around. I reached for the flashlight beside me and clicked it on. The beam was weak, the batteries already starting to die. I swung my legs over the bed, crept to the window, and peered outside. Nothing, just the trees swaying, the darkness stretching endlessly beyond them. I waited, listening. The sound had stopped. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch falling, or a raccoon knocking something over. I crawled back into bed, but sleep didn't come easy. My ears stayed sharp, listening for anything else. Morning came slow. The air inside the cabin was freezing, my breath visible as I exhaled. I built a fire, boiled some water for coffee, and stepped outside to take in the daylight. The forest felt different in the morning, less intimidating, more alive. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, looking for anything out of place. That's when I saw it. Footprints, not mine. They circled the cabin, uneven and deep, like whoever left them had been dragging their feet. I followed them to the edge of the clearing, where they disappeared into the trees. My stomach knotted. I hadn't heard anyone, hadn't seen any sign of another person. Who had been here? The rest of the day I felt on edge. Every noise made me tense. I kept checking the woods, expecting to see someone watching me. I didn't, but the feeling never left. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair. I kept the axe from the woodpile next to my bed. I didn't sleep much, The next morning, the footprints were back. More of them, closer to the cabin. Some led right up to the windows. I packed my things, fast. I didn't care how much time I had left on this so-called retreat. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded up the truck and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. Popping the hood, I checked the engine, even though I barely knew what I was looking at. Everything seemed fine, but the truck wouldn't start. My chest tightened. I had no cell service, no radio. The only way back to town was on foot. A trip that would take me at least half a day. But staying? That wasn't an option. I grabbed my backpack, filled it with supplies, and started walking. I didn't look back. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I kept moving. The sun was setting when I finally reached the main road. The relief was overwhelming, but I didn't stop. I kept walking until I saw headlights. The driver was an old man in a pickup. He rolled down his window and asked if I was all right. I told him my truck broke down. I didn't mention the footprints. He gave me a ride to town. I never went back to that cabin. Left the truck, left everything. Told my family it wasn't safe. They thought I was overreacting. Maybe I was, but I know what I saw, and I wasn't alone up there. I used to think solitude was peaceful. That was before I spent 3 nights alone in a cabin deep in the Oregon woods. Now I know better. It started as a simple getaway. My job had been stressing me out, and I needed a break from the city. A friend of mine had mentioned a secluded cabin he rented out now and then. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just trees and silence. It sounded perfect. He gave me the key, wished me well, and told me to take care. I should have noticed the way he hesitated before saying that. The drive was long, winding through back roads that grew narrower the deeper I went. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees. The place was small but sturdy, built from thick logs with a slanted roof and a porch that creaked under my weight. There was a single lock on the front door, nothing fancy. Inside, there was a couch, a fireplace, and a tiny kitchen that smelled like old wood and dust. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and a bathroom with an outdated sink and mirror. I set my bags down and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Felt different from the city, cleaner, heavier. Outside, the forest was a wall of darkness, the trees standing tall and silent. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. The first night was uneventful. I read a book by candlelight and listened to the wind outside. The silence was comforting at first. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in the thick blankets on the bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Took me a moment to figure out why. The air inside the cabin felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. Even in a forest, there should be sounds. Insects, distant animals, the wind rustling the leaves. But there was nothing, just silence. I sat up and listened, my breath slow and steady. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something brushing against the cabin walls. Came from outside, near the front porch. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but something about it didn't sit right. The sound wasn't random. It was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their fingertips along the wood. I stayed in bed, barely breathing. The sound circled the cabin, moving from the front to the side, then to the back. I clenched my fists, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, it stopped. I didn't move for a long time. The next morning, I went outside and checked the perimeter. Nothing seemed out of place. There were no tracks, no signs of an animal. The only thing I noticed was a faint mark on the porch railing, 3 long, parallel scratches. I ran my fingers over them, but they weren't deep. Probably nothing, I told myself. Just my imagination running wild. The second night was worse. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly. Didn't. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening. The forest outside was quiet again, too quiet. Around midnight, the scraping sound returned. It started at the front porch, just like before, then moved along the walls. But this time there was something else. A soft clicking noise, like fingernails tapping on glass. I held my breath. The only window in the bedroom was small, set high up on the wall. I turned my head slowly and looked at it. The tapping stopped. My stomach twisted. I told myself it was tree branches, even though I knew there were no trees close enough to touch the cabin. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly stopped breathing. I sat up, my hands gripping the blanket so hard my knuckles turned white. The door didn't have a deadbolt, just the single lock. I prayed it would hold. The knob twisted again, harder this time, but didn't turn all the way. Whoever or whatever was outside, they were testing it, seeing if it would give. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours. Eventually, the rattling stopped. Then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I forced myself to go outside. My hands shook as I checked the porch. This time, there were footprints in the dirt. Bare footprints. Human. I packed my things, threw them in the car, and started the engine. I didn't care about the refund. I didn't care about anything except leaving that place behind. As I drove away, I glanced at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just inside the tree line, barely visible in the morning light. They didn't move, didn't chase after me. They just stood there, watching. I pressed my foot down on the gas, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know who they were. I don't want to know. All I know is that I won't ever go back to that cabin, and I will never spend another night alone in the woods again. I should have never gone up there alone. The thought repeats in my head like a warning I ignored too late. It started as a simple plan. Drive up to the old hunting cabin, spend a quiet weekend alone, and come back refreshed. I needed the break. Work had been draining, and I figured a few days away from everything would do me some good. My uncle owned the cabin, and he used to take me there when I was younger. It was deep in the woods, far from any town, with no cell service, no internet. Just a small wooden structure with a fireplace, a bed, and an old gas stove. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive was long, winding through dense forest, the road barely more than a dirt path. The sun was already setting when I pulled up to the clearing. The cabin was just as I remembered: weathered wood, a slanted roof, and a single window in the front. It looked abandoned, but that was to be expected. My uncle hadn't been up here in years. Inside, everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but it was still intact. The fireplace had a small stack of wood beside it. The bed had an old wool blanket, and the kitchen was stocked with a few canned goods. It smelled like damp wood and something faintly sour, but I ignored it. I spent the evening settling in. I unpacked my bag, lit the lantern, and got a small fire going in the fireplace. The silence was overwhelming at first. No hum of electricity, no passing cars, just the occasional creak of the wood and the wind outside. It was peaceful in a way. The first night was uneventful. I slept deeply, wrapped in the thick wool blanket, the fire crackling softly. When I woke, the sun was filtering through the window, and the air was crisp. I made coffee on the old gas stove, sat on the front steps, and watched the woods. There was something calming about being so isolated. No distractions, no obligations, just the quiet. That feeling didn't last. By midday, I started noticing things that felt off, little details. The first thing was the axe. My uncle always kept it on the chopping block outside, but when I went to split some wood, it was missing. I checked the small shed near the cabin, thinking maybe he had moved it, but it wasn't there either. I shrugged it off. Maybe he had taken it home the last time he visited. Then there were the footprints. I saw them near the tree line when I went to gather some kindling. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were different, wider, heavier, and they weren't leading away from the cabin. They were leading toward it. I felt a little uneasy after that, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were old prints from my uncle. Maybe an animal had left them, and I was just imagining things. I tried to push the thought aside and went about my day, but as the sun dipped lower, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. That night, I double-checked the locks before going to bed. The cabin had an old wooden latch on the door, nothing fancy, but it was secure. I stoked the fire, made sure my flashlight was within reach, and tried to sleep. At some point during the night, I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the cabin. The room was silent, too silent. Took me a moment to realize what had woken me. It was a sound. Something had been outside. I listened, my heart hammering, but I didn't hear it again. Just the wind, just the creaking of the old wood. I told myself I was imagining things. I rolled over, pulled the blanket tighter, and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw them, more footprints. They were fresh, leading from the woods to the front of the cabin. They stopped right at the door. Someone had been standing there, watching me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My first thought was to pack up and leave, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe stubbornness. Maybe I didn't want to admit how scared I was. I convinced myself it was just a hunter, maybe someone passing through. I told myself there was no real danger, but deep down I knew better. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking the tree line every few minutes, listening for any sound that didn't belong. When night came, I made sure the fire was strong, the door locked, and my flashlight within reach. I didn't sleep. At some point in the night, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Then something else, a soft, scraping noise against the wood. It went on for what felt like forever. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would give me away. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then silence. I don't know how long I lay there before exhaustion took over. When I woke, it was morning. The fire was nearly out, and the room was cold. I stepped outside, dreading what I might see. There were more footprints circling the cabin, and something else. Scratches on the door. Not deep, but deliberate, like someone had dragged a knife across the wood. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag, threw everything into the truck, and got the hell out of there. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, where I finally had cell service. I never told my uncle what happened. Never told anyone, really. But I know this, whoever was out there, they weren't lost. They weren't just passing through. They knew I was there, and they wanted me to know it too. I don't know what made me take the trip to the cabin. Maybe it was the stress, the need to get away, or just the fact that I had nowhere else to be. It wasn't even my cabin. It belonged to my uncle, who rarely used it. He told me about it once, said it was old, out in the woods and a little rough, but it had a roof, a bed, and a fireplace. That was good enough for me. I needed space to breathe, so I packed a bag, loaded my truck, and drove out there. The drive took longer than I expected. The paved roads turned to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to a barely there path covered in dead leaves and twigs. My truck struggled against the uneven ground, bouncing over dips and ruts. The sun was already starting to set by the time I saw the cabin. A dark wooden thing, small and forgotten, tucked between tall trees. The windows were dusty, the porch sagged slightly, and the door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I parked, grabbed my bag, and made my way up the creaking steps. The key was exactly where my uncle said it would be, under a loose plank on the porch. The lock resisted at first, then gave with a loud click. The door swung open with a groan, and I stepped inside. It smelled like old wood, dust, and something stale, something that reminded me of a room that had been shut up for too long. I found the light switch near the door, flipped it, but nothing happened. No power. That was fine. I had a flashlight and plenty of batteries. I walked through the cabin, checking each room. There wasn't much to it, just a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, a tiny bathroom, and a single bedroom. The furniture was old, the kind that looked like it had been left there by different owners over the years. A couch with torn fabric, a wooden table with deep scratches, a rocking chair that made the floor creak when I touched it. The bedroom had a simple bed frame, a thin mattress, and a heavy wool blanket folded at the foot. I set my bag down, lit a couple of candles, and sat on the couch. The silence out here was thick. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity. Just the occasional rustling of trees and the distant call of some bird. It should have been peaceful, but something about it felt off. Maybe it was just the unfamiliarity. I wasn't used to being this alone. As night settled in, the temperature dropped. I threw some wood into the fireplace and lit it up. The flames cast flickering shadows across the walls. I ate a quick meal from the supplies I brought, some canned food and beef jerky, then stretched out on the couch. I didn't feel like going to bed just yet. Instead, I just sat there listening. Then I heard it, a sound from outside. It wasn't an animal, at least it didn't sound like one. It was steady, slow, a crunching of leaves, then a pause, then another crunch, like footsteps. I sat up, heart suddenly beating faster. I told myself it was nothing, probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. But I reached for my flashlight anyway and stood up, moving slowly toward the window. I shined the light outside. The beam cut through the dark, sweeping over the trees, the ground, the edge of the porch. Nothing, just the woods. I waited for a minute, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe my brain was just playing tricks on me. I locked the door anyway. The night stretched on. The fire died down, leaving the cabin in near total darkness except for the weak glow of the candles. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that sound, about the way it had stopped when I stood up, like someone or something was waiting, watching. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the feeling of cold air on my face. The fire was completely out. The room was pitch black. And then I realized the front door was open, not just unlocked, open. A few inches, just enough to see the darkness beyond it. My stomach dropped. I knew for a fact I had locked that door. I forced myself to breathe, to move. I sat up slowly, listening. The woods were dead silent. No wind, no animals, just stillness. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the door. The beam wavered slightly in my shaking hands. I stood up, my heart hammering, and stepped forward. My brain was screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but I needed to see. I needed to know if someone was out there. I reached the door and pushed it shut. The lock clicked into place. I stood there for a long moment, listening. Nothing, just silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came slow. The light filtering through the trees felt weak, like the sun itself didn't want to be out here. I packed my things, threw my bag over my shoulder, and stepped onto the porch. The dirt outside the door was disturbed. Footprints, not mine. They led from the trees to my door, then back again. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. I got into my truck and left. Drove fast, not caring about the bumps or ruts in the road. Didn't look back. I never told my uncle what happened. Never asked him if he ever noticed anything strange about the cabin. I just knew one thing: I wasn't going back. Ever. I remember the cold more than anything else. The way it sank into my bones, making my hands shake and my breath come out in thick, white clouds. The drive up the mountain had been long, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting behind the trees. It wasn't a nice sunset. The sky just faded from gray to black without much color, like the light had just given up for the day. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Dark logs stacked together, the roof heavy with damp, rotting leaves. The windows were small and covered in a thin layer of grime. It wasn't my cabin. I had rented it from some guy online who had listed it as a quiet, isolated retreat in nature. I parked my truck on the gravel driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the cabin. Something about it made my stomach feel tight, but I told myself it was just nerves. I had come out here to be alone, to get away from people, to clear my head. It wasn't supposed to be comfortable. I grabbed my bags, locked the truck, and made my way up the steps to the front door. The key was under the mat, just like the owner had said it would be. It was old and a little bent, but it slid into the lock just fine. When I pushed the door open, the smell hit me first. damp wood, stale air, a hint of something sour, like the place had been left alone too long. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. The cabin was small. A living room with a couch that looked like it hadn't been sat on in years. A tiny kitchen with outdated appliances. A single hallway leading to a bedroom and a bathroom. There was a fireplace, but no wood stacked inside it. I dropped my bags on the floor and exhaled. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I just stood there in the growing dark, listening. The place was silent except for the occasional groan of the wood shifting. I told myself it was just an old building settling. Just my imagination making it sound like something more than it was. I flicked on a light and started unpacking. It didn't take long. I hadn't brought much. Just a duffel bag with clothes, some canned food, a knife, and a flashlight. The essentials. I had planned to stay for a week, maybe more if I felt like it. That first night was uneventful. I heated up a can of soup on the stove, sat at the wobbly kitchen table, and ate in silence. The wind howled outside, rattling the trees. It was cold, but the old radiator in the corner still worked, giving off just enough heat to keep the place from freezing. I went to bed early, climbing under the thick, musty-smelling blankets. I slept, but not well. The second day I explored. There was a trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The trees were tall and close together, their bare branches tangled like skeletal fingers. It was dead quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching the frost-covered ground. I walked for maybe an hour before I turned back. I don't know why I did. Something about the woods just didn't feel right. The air felt too still, like it was waiting. I wasn't scared exactly, but I wasn't comfortable either. I made it back to the cabin before dark and locked the door behind me. That night I heard something, a soft scraping sound just outside, like something brushing against the walls. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I listened. The sound came again, slow, careful, not the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and got up. The floor was cold against my bare feet as I crept toward the window. I hesitated before pulling back the curtain, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing, just darkness, just trees. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the night. Then I heard it again, but this time it wasn't outside. It was inside, a soft creak like weight shifting on old wood. My stomach dropped. I turned slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping across the small cabin. The door to the bedroom was still shut, the bathroom door too, but the closet in the hallway, the one I hadn't checked since I arrived, was open just a crack. I didn't move for a long time, just stood there, listening to my own pulse pounding in my ears. Then slowly I walked forward. My legs felt stiff, my breath shallow. The closet door was only open an inch or two. Not enough for anything or anyone to be inside. Just the old wooden shelves where I had tossed my jacket earlier. I grabbed the edge of the door and yanked it open. Nothing, just emptiness. Just my jacket hanging there, swaying slightly from my sudden movement. I let out a slow breath. My hands were shaking. I told myself I was being stupid, that I was just on edge, alone in an unfamiliar place. My mind playing tricks on me. I shut the closet door firmly and went back to bed. I didn't sleep much after that. The next few days, things got worse. Small things at first. My backpack wasn't where I left it. The front door was unlocked in the morning when I was sure I had locked it before bed. The food in the kitchen seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I started hearing noises at night. Scraping, tapping, sometimes a soft, distant creaking like footsteps. Always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure if I was imagining them. On the fifth night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. It was close, too close, not my own. A slow, steady inhale, an exhale. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My body locked in place, stiff with terror. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't. I just lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening. And then it stopped. Just like that, gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed in bed until the first light of dawn, then packed my things. I was done. I didn't care how much time I had left on the rental. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded my bags into the truck, slammed the door shut, and turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. The truck wouldn't start. I tried again and again. Just a clicking sound. The battery was dead. That didn't make sense. I had checked it before I left home. It was fine. I popped the hood, got out to look, and that's when I saw it. The wires were cut. Clean. Precise. Someone had done this on purpose. I stood there, staring down at the engine, my breath coming fast, my hands clenched into fists. Someone had been out here, messing with my truck, watching me, maybe even inside the cabin while I slept. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I just ran. Down the gravel driveway into the woods. I didn't know where I was going. Just away. Away from the cabin. Away from whatever was out there with me. I don't know how long I ran. Hours maybe. The sun was high in the sky when I finally stumbled onto a road. A narrow, empty stretch of pavement cutting through the trees. I collapsed onto the shoulder, gasping for breath, my legs burning. A truck passed by not long after. The driver was an older man, a hunter maybe. He pulled over, asked if I was okay. I told him I needed help, that my truck had broken down back at my cabin. He looked at me, then glanced toward the direction I had come from. And then, very quietly, he said, "There's no cabins up that way." I didn't argue. I just got in his truck and never looked back. I never liked cabins. Something about being isolated in the middle of nowhere just made me uneasy. But when my cousin Mike told me about this small hunting cabin he'd found way up in the mountains, far from any roads or trails, I let myself get talked into a weekend trip. He swore it was the perfect place to get away. No cell service, no distractions. Just a few days of peace, quiet, and maybe some deer if we were lucky. The drive took us 5 hours. 3 of those were on decent roads, but the last 2 were nothing but rough, winding dirt paths that seemed barely wide enough for my truck. By the time we got close, the sun had already started dipping behind the trees. The cabin was tucked deep into the woods, almost hidden unless you knew exactly where to look. It wasn't big, just one room with a small loft for storage, a rusty old wood stove, and a couple of beat-up chairs. There was no electricity, no running water, just an old well about 20 yards away and an outhouse even farther. I already hated it, but Mike, always the outdoorsman, was thrilled. He tossed his bag inside and started talking about how we'd set up for the night. The plan was simple. Drop our gear, get a fire going, and settle in. I forced myself to shake off the feeling of unease and focus on the trip. After all, I'd been camping before, and this wasn't any different, just a little more remote. We got the fire started, cooked some food over the flames, and let the exhaustion from the drive set in. I figured a few beers would help me relax, but the silence of the forest made it impossible. No cars, no distant hum of a highway, just the crackling fire and the occasional rustling in the trees. I told myself it was just animals, nothing unusual, but something felt off. We turned in early. The cabin only had one bed, so Mike took that, and I set up my sleeping bag on the floor near the door. I figured I'd sleep fine, but I kept waking up. Every little noise outside made my pulse jump. At one point, I was sure I heard something. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I held my breath, straining my ears. Nothing, just the wind. The next morning, I stepped outside to find something strange. The dirt around the cabin was disturbed. There were marks, almost like footprints, but they weren't quite right. Too wide, too deep, like someone had been pacing around all night. Mike brushed it off, saying it was probably just an animal, maybe a bear. But I've seen bear tracks. These weren't bear tracks. The day went on as planned. We hiked a little, set up some makeshift targets, and wasted a few hours shooting. Everything felt normal until we got back to the cabin. That feeling hit me again. The kind that makes your skin crawl, like someone's watching you. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something. But every time I looked, there was nothing but trees. That night, I slept even worse. The noises outside were back, louder this time. more deliberate. I was sure I heard something scrape against the cabin wall. Then the sound of twigs snapping. Something was out there. I wanted to wake Mike, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I kept my hand close to my knife and forced myself to stay still, listening. The sounds went on for hours. It wasn't until just before dawn that I finally dozed off. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was that the firewood we had stacked outside was scattered. Some of it was missing entirely. I told Mike, but he just shrugged and said we must have left it too close to the tree line. Maybe an animal had dragged some off, but I knew that wasn't right. Something had been outside, moving things, watching. I wanted to leave. I told Mike I wasn't feeling great, made up some excuse about work. He was annoyed but didn't argue. We packed up fast, loading everything into the truck. As I went to grab the last bag from the cabin, I noticed something by the window. A single handprint smeared on the glass. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Mike's. And it was on the outside. I didn't say anything. I just got in the truck and started driving. We didn't talk much on the way back. The whole trip had felt wrong. A few weeks later, Mike called me. He had gone back to the cabin with a couple of friends. But when they got there, something was different. The door had been ripped off the hinges. The inside was trashed, like someone had torn the place apart looking for something. They never found out who or what had been there, and I never went back. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the way the guy made it seem so simple, so harmless. A last-minute opportunity to get away, disconnect, and clear my head. The place is basic, but it's got everything you need, he had said, handing me the keys to the old cabin. You'll love it. Quiet, middle of nowhere. No one will bother you. That last part was what sold me. I had been working too much, stuck in a cycle of deadlines and screens, and I just needed to be alone for a while. The idea of an isolated cabin sounded perfect. No cell service, no internet, just me and my thoughts. I packed light, some canned food, a flashlight, a good knife, my sleeping bag. I figured I'd only stay for a few nights. A long drive, a little hike up into the woods, and I'd be there. The place was just like he described, basic. A single room with a small wood stove, a rickety table, and an old cot in the corner. The air smelled of damp wood and dust. There was a small window facing the trees and another on the door, but otherwise it felt closed in. Secluded. Safe. First, it was peaceful. I settled in, set up my sleeping bag, and started a fire in the stove. I sat outside for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. The silence was heavy, but it felt good. Clean. I hadn't realized how much noise I had been drowning in every day until it was gone. I should have left the first night. It started with small things. I heard something moving outside just after midnight. Just the wind, I told myself. Maybe an animal. Still, I double-checked the door, made sure it was locked, and went back to sleep. But something woke me again an hour later. A noise closer this time, like a footstep. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Nothing. No more footsteps. No movement. No sound except for the distant rustling of branches. I forced myself to lie back down, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next day, I went out early trying to shake off the unease. I explored the area, walked through the trees, followed a small stream downhill. It was beautiful in the way untouched places are, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't explain. Like I wasn't really alone, like something was watching me. I told myself it was paranoia. City nerves acting up in the quiet. That night, the noises came back, louder this time, not just footsteps, but something brushing against the walls of the cabin. I sat up, holding my knife, staring at the door. Then the doorknob moved, just a little, a slight, slow turn, like someone testing if it was locked. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then, nothing. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I didn't sleep. By morning, I convinced myself it was an animal. A bear, maybe, sniffing around. That made sense, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. That whatever had tested the door had done it on purpose. I decided to leave that day. I packed my things, made sure the fire was out, and started down the trail. But after walking for an hour, I realized something was wrong. I should have reached the dirt road by now. I checked my map, my compass. Everything pointed the right way, but the trail wasn't right. It wasn't the same one I had taken up. It looked the same, but I knew it wasn't. Trees I didn't remember, turns that shouldn't have been there. My stomach dropped. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps. The more I walked, the more wrong it felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there before me. Someone who knew the woods better than I did. Someone who had led me in circles. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was already setting. I had no choice but to stay another night. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my knife in hand, back against the wall, watching the door. I listened. The sounds came again. Footsteps, movement, the slow, deliberate press of something against the walls. Then the doorknob turned. Not just a little this time, a full, careful twist. I held my breath. The lock held. The door didn't open, but the silence that followed was worse. It lasted for hours, stretching into the early morning. I didn't move until the first light came through the window. I left at dawn. Didn't pack, didn't stop. I ran. I didn't care if I got lost. Didn't care if I left things behind. I just ran. The trail was still wrong, but I kept going. I don't know how long I walked, how many times I thought I heard footsteps behind me, just out of sight. When I finally reached the road, my car was there, untouched, just sitting there like nothing had happened. I got in and drove without looking back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they wanted me to leave or if they wanted me to stay longer. I don't know if they were alone. I only know that I'll never go back.